Story number 1.
The storm had rolled in quickly that night, the kind of storm that rattled windows and drowned the world in darkness. Jenna had been on her way back from a weekend trip when her car's engine began sputtering just as the rain turned torrential. She managed to coast into the driveway of a small, unfamiliar house at the edge of the woods before the engine died completely. Her phone had no signal, and the road she'd been driving on was deserted. The rain came down in sheets, making it impossible to see much past the car's windshield. Reluctantly, Jenna decided to approach the house and ask for help. It wasn't her ideal scenario, but she figured it was better than sitting alone in the dark, hoping someone would drive by. The house was old and weathered, its shutters hanging at odd angles and the paint peeling from the siding. The porch creaked under her weight as she knocked on the door, her heart pounding louder than the rain. For a moment, there was no response, and Jenna thought the house might be abandoned. But just as she was about to turn back, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, with dark circles under her eyes. She looked older than Jenna, perhaps in her late 40s, though her weary expression made her seem ageless. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice soft but devoid of warmth. "I'm so sorry to bother you," Jenna began. "My car broke down, and I don't have any cell service. Could I use your phone to call for a tow truck?" The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering past Jenna to the storm raging behind her. "The phone doesn't work during storms," she said after a moment, "but you can wait inside until the rain lets up." Jenna hesitated but nodded, grateful for the offer. The woman stepped aside, and Jenna entered the house, immediately struck by how cold it was inside. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the dim lighting cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. The furniture was old and mismatched, and a layer of dust coated every surface. "I'll make some tea," the woman said, disappearing into what Jenna assumed was the kitchen. Jenna sat on the worn couch, her damp clothes clinging to her skin. The rain hammered against the windows, and somewhere in the house a clock ticked steadily. She glanced around the room, noting the outdated decor and the faded photographs on the mantel. One photo caught her attention, a young girl with long, dark hair standing in front of the very house she was in. The girl wasn't smiling, and her eyes seemed too large for her face, filled with an intensity that made Jenna uneasy. "Is that your daughter?" Jenna asked when the woman returned with 2 mugs of tea. The woman froze for a moment, her gaze flicking to the photograph. "It was," she said softly, setting the mugs on the coffee table. Jenna didn't press further. The way the woman said "was" left a chill in the air, heavier than the storm outside. She sipped her tea in silence, trying to ignore the gnawing unease that had settled in her stomach. Minutes passed, the quiet between them broken only by the ticking clock and the occasional rumble of thunder. Then Jenna heard it, a faint creak, like footsteps coming from upstairs. She glanced at the woman, but her expression didn't change. "Do you have someone else here?" Jenna asked, trying to sound casual. The woman's lips tightened. "No, it's just us." Jenna frowned, her ears straining. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate, moving across the ceiling above them. She set her mug down, her fingers trembling slightly. "Are you sure? It sounds like—" "It's the house," the woman interrupted sharply. "It makes noises during storms." Jenna nodded, though she didn't believe her. The footsteps were too precise, too deliberate to be the groaning of old wood. She tried to shake off the unease, telling herself it was just her imagination. But then the sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't coming from upstairs anymore. It was coming from the hallway. Jenna turned her head, her heart pounding as she stared at the darkened hallway leading deeper into the house. The shadows seemed to shift, moving in ways that didn't match the flickering light of the lamp. She thought she saw something, a figure, small and indistinct, standing at the edge of the shadows. "Who's there?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. She just sat there, staring into her tea, her hands gripping the mug so tightly her knuckles turned white. The figure in the hallway didn't move. Jenna's breathing quickened as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure was small, like a child, but its features were obscured, shrouded in darkness. And then it moved, stepping forward, just enough for Jenna to see its face. It was the girl from the photograph. Her eyes were wide and empty, her skin pale and waxy. Her mouth hung slightly open as though she were about to speak, but no sound came out. Jenna felt a scream rising in her throat, but she couldn't make a sound. She was frozen, paralyzed by the girl's hollow stare. The woman finally looked up, her expression a mixture of sadness and resignation. "She won't hurt you," she said quietly. "She just doesn't understand." Jenna shot to her feet, backing away from the hallway. "What is this? Who is she?" The woman sighed, setting her mug down on the table. "My daughter, Lily. She's been here ever since the accident." Jenna shook her head, her mind racing. No, she's not." She couldn't bring herself to say the word. "She doesn't know she's gone," the woman said, her voice breaking. "She's been waiting for someone to play with, waiting for someone to see her." The girl in the hallway took another step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Jenna stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall. "I have to go," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't stay here." The woman didn't stop her. She just nodded, her eyes filled with an unbearable sadness. "You should go," she said, "before she gets too attached." Jenna didn't wait for an explanation. She grabbed her coat and bolted for the door, throwing it open and running into the storm. The rain soaked her within seconds, but she didn't care. She sprinted to her car, yanking the door open and collapsing into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life on the first try, and Jenna didn't look back as she sped away, the house disappearing into the darkness behind her. She didn't stop driving until she reached a gas station miles down the road. There, under the harsh fluorescent lights, she finally let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind replaying the events of the night. She never told anyone about what happened, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd brought something with her when she left. Sometimes, late at night, she thought she heard footsteps in her apartment, soft and deliberate, moving just outside her bedroom door. And sometimes when she closed her eyes, she saw the girl's face, her empty eyes staring back at her, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The rain had been relentless for 3 days straight, the kind of storm that drowned the countryside in gray and kept everyone indoors. Olivia, fresh from her breakup and desperate for a change of scenery, had rented an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of house you'd see on a postcard, gabled roof, ivy crawling up the sides, a wraparound porch. It looked harmless enough in the photos. In person, though, it had a different weight to it. The key was under the mat, just as the landlord had promised. Olivia hesitated before sliding it into the lock, glancing up at the dark windows. They seemed to watch her, like eyes in the storm. She shook off the thought. It was just a house. She was here to relax, to reset. The inside smelled of wood polish and dust. The furniture was antique, heavy, and worn with use, but it gave the house a charm she appreciated. There was a large fireplace in the sitting room, a kitchen with a creaky floor, and upstairs 3 bedrooms. Olivia chose the smallest, with a view of the overgrown garden out back. It felt cozy. Safe. The first night was uneventful, save for the storm rattling the windows. Olivia fell asleep to the sound of rain, cocooned in the unfamiliar silence of the countryside. The second night she noticed the light. She'd been lying in bed, scrolling aimlessly on her phone, when a faint glow caught her attention. It came from under the door, as if someone had turned on the hallway light. She frowned, certain she hadn't left it on. Gathering her courage, she slipped out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was dark. The third night, the knocking began. It was subtle at first, a single, soft rap against the bedroom wall. Olivia thought it might be the storm playing tricks again, the wind shaking the house, but then it came again, and again. The knocks were rhythmic, deliberate. They moved from one side of the room to the other, as if someone or something was circling her. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Olivia called the landlord, Mr. Harker, to ask if the house had a history of pests. He chuckled, his voice warm but dismissive. "No pests, just an old house settling. Happens all the time." Still, Olivia couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her like a second skin. That evening, she explored the house, trying to distract herself. In the attic, she found a trunk filled with old photographs, letters, and yellow documents. One photograph caught her eye. A family standing stiffly in front of the house, their faces solemn. A man, a woman, and a young girl in a white dress. Something about the girl's expression unsettled her. Her eyes seemed too intense, too knowing for someone so young. As Olivia flipped the photo over, she noticed writing scrawled on the back. The Graysons, 1921. Beneath it, in a different hand, someone had added, "Forgive me." That night, Olivia tried to convince herself she was overthinking things. Houses had histories, old families, old stories. It didn't mean anything. But then the knocking returned. It started softly, like before. A few taps on the wall near the bed. Then it grew louder, insistent. This time, it wasn't just the walls. It was the ceiling, the floor, the door. She could hear footsteps now, heavy and deliberate, pacing the hallway. Her breath caught when the doorknob began to rattle. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Olivia sat frozen in her bed, clutching her phone, but when she tried to call someone, anyone, the screen refused to unlock. It flickered, then went black. And then the whispering began. It was faint at first, like the hum of a distant conversation. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the room. "Please, stop," Olivia whispered, tears streaming down her face. As if in response, the whispers grew louder. The air in the room grew colder, and Olivia's breath fogged in the dim light. She pulled the blankets over her head, squeezing her eyes shut, and prayed for the morning to come. When dawn finally broke, the house was silent again. Olivia packed her things, ready to leave, but when she tried the front door, it wouldn't budge. The locks turned, the handle twisted, but the door remained firmly shut. Panicked, she tried the back door, the windows, even the cellar entrance. Every exit was locked tight, as if the house itself had decided she wasn't leaving. Desperate, Olivia returned to the attic, hoping for some clue, some answer. As she rummaged through the trunk, she found a journal tucked beneath the photographs. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. April 15th, 1921. Eleanor has been restless. The doctor says she's not ill, but we know better. The things she says, the things she sees. We don't know how to help her. April 28th, 1921. Eleanor is gone. Not gone as in dead, but gone as in lost. She stares out the window for hours, speaking to things we cannot see. The whispers keep us awake at night. May 2nd, 1921. The ritual was supposed to help. I was desperate. But now she is everywhere. She is the house. Olivia dropped the journal, her hands trembling. She could feel it now, the house watching her, listening. That night, the whispers came again, louder than ever. The walls seemed to breathe. The floorboards groaned under invisible weight. And in the corner of her room, just beyond the reach of the lamplight, a shadow began to form. It was small at first, just a smudge of darkness, but it grew, taking shape. The figure of a little girl in a white dress. Her face was pale, her eyes black voids that bore into Olivia's soul. "Why won't you leave?" the girl whispered, her voice soft but filled with menace. "I can't," Olivia stammered. "The doors." "You're not supposed to be here," the girl interrupted, stepping closer. The air in the room turned icy. Olivia backed into the corner, her heart racing. "What do you want?" she choked out. The girl tilted her head as if considering the question. Then she smiled, a slow, unnatural stretch of her lips. "You." The lights flickered and went out. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and Olivia screamed as the shadows enveloped her. The next morning, the house stood quiet and still, its windows reflecting the gray sky. When the landlord arrived to check on Olivia, the house was empty. Her car was still in the driveway, her belongings untouched, but there was no sign of her. Mr. Harker shook his head, muttering something about city folk and their nerves. But as he turned to leave, he paused. In the dirt outside the front door, small footprints led into the house. Footprints too small to belong to an adult. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The house on Ashford Street had always been an enigma to Lisa. As a child, she'd passed it on her way to school, fascinated by its ivy-covered exterior and dark, almost foreboding windows. The house was always quiet, always still. It had a history in the town. A family had lived there for generations, and no one had been able to recall the last time it had been inhabited. Yet, despite its dilapidated state, the house never seemed abandoned. It seemed watched. Years passed, and Lisa's curiosity about the house never waned. She had grown up and moved to a nearby city, but whenever she visited her hometown, she couldn't resist driving past Ashford Street. The house remained as it always had, imposing, silent, and cold. It wasn't until she returned one autumn evening, looking for a temporary place to stay after her recent breakup, that the house would finally come to her attention in a new way. Lisa was looking for a quiet retreat, a place to sort her thoughts and regain some peace of mind. When she found out that the old house had been put up for rent, she couldn't resist. The landlord, Mr. Jenkins, was an old man with a heavy limp and a distant look in his eyes. He had warned her that the house had a reputation, but his words were vague and filled with an unsettling kindness, like he was speaking out of politeness rather than experience. "Most people can't handle it," Mr. Jenkins said, shaking his head slowly as he handed over the keys. "It gets under your skin, that house. But if you're sure, well, it's yours." Lisa dismissed his words as superstition. She was strong-minded, independent, and in control of her life. The house seemed perfect for her needs, quiet, secluded, and filled with character. So, with a final nod to Mr. Jenkins, she drove up the long, winding lane to the house. The first thing that struck her was the smell, an old, musty scent that lingered in the air like dust and mildew. The floor creaked under her feet as she stepped inside, and the dim light from the overcast sky filtered weakly through the dusty windows. There was a fireplace in the living room, the hearth cold and unused. The furniture was sparse but elegant in an old-fashioned way, with dark wooden tables and faded velvet chairs. The house, despite its age and neglect, had a kind of haunting beauty to it. She set her bags down in the entryway and explored the house. Upstairs, there was a large bedroom with a four-poster bed draped in faded floral sheets. There was a vanity by the window, a thick layer of dust covering the surface. As she moved toward it, her eyes caught the reflection of a woman in the glass. For a moment, Lisa felt a chill crawl up her spine. But when she turned, there was no one behind her, only the dim light of the late afternoon. It was just her mind playing tricks on her. She shook off the feeling and went to bed early that night, eager to get some rest. The house felt peaceful, but as she lay in bed, listening to the faint rustling of trees outside, something strange began to happen. At first, it was just a sound, a soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped. Lisa froze, listening intently. The sound came again, followed by a scraping noise like furniture being dragged across the floor. Her heart started to race, but she rationalized it. Old houses made noises, especially when the wind picked up. But then there was something else. A voice. It was soft at first, a faint whisper coming from the hallway outside her room. Lisa strained her ears to make out the words. It sounded like someone was calling her name. Soft, pleading, but just faint enough that she couldn't fully hear it. Lisa. Her breath caught in her throat. She hesitated for a long time, too afraid to get up and check, but too curious to lie there in silence. Slowly, she crept out of bed, her bare feet pressing against the cool wooden floor. She tiptoed to the door and cracked it open. The hallway was empty, save for the flickering light from the old chandelier at the end. But then, as her eyes moved down the dark hallway, they caught on something, a shadow, flickering at the corner of her vision. She blinked hard, but when she looked again, it was gone. A shiver ran through her. She quickly shut the door and locked it. The whispers, though, did not stop. They seemed to circle the room, growing louder as if something or someone was pacing just outside. Her body tensed. She tried to ignore the sounds, curling into a ball beneath the covers, but her thoughts raced. Who was there? What was happening? Hours passed and the noises slowly faded. By morning, everything was quiet again. Lisa barely slept, but when she looked in the mirror, she noticed something strange. Dark circles under her eyes, her face pale. It was as if night had aged her. Over the next few days, the oddities increased. The whispers came back, always at night, always just out of reach. She could feel eyes on her when she sat in the living room. Sometimes she'd catch movement in the corners of her vision, something flickering in the dark just before she turned to look. But each time, the room would be empty. One evening, after another sleepless night, Lisa decided to leave. She was done with the house. But as she grabbed her things, she noticed something strange. On the old vanity in her room, there was a small object that hadn't been there before. It was a ring. An old, tarnished silver ring with an intricate pattern etched into its surface. She picked it up, feeling its weight, but before she could examine it further, she was struck with an overwhelming sense of nausea. The air in the room thickened. Her throat felt tight, and then for the briefest of moments, she saw it, the reflection of a woman standing behind her in the mirror. Lisa whipped around. No one was there, but the mirror. The reflection was different now. The woman's eyes were empty, hollow, and the corners of her mouth were stretched into a grim, knowing smile. The room seemed to close in on her. The walls felt like they were pressing against her chest, and she gasped for air. She didn't know what was happening, but she could feel the presence of something, someone, watching her. She had to get out. She ran from the house, not bothering to grab her things. The rain was pouring down, but she didn't care. She ran until she reached the town, where she stopped in front of a coffee shop, breathing heavily. Her hands were shaking. It wasn't until she calmed down that she realized something. She hadn't been alone in the house. The whispers, the cold air, the ring. It all pointed to one thing. The woman in the mirror. The woman who had lived there before. A few weeks later, Lisa returned to town, hoping the experience had been a dream. She went to the local library to look into the history of the house, seeking answers. The librarian, a woman in her 50s, gave her a strange look when Lisa asked. "That house has been empty for years," she said quietly. "But there was once a family that lived there. A mother, father, and daughter. The daughter, Eleanor, she vanished one night, and they say she was never found. Some believe she never left." Lisa shuddered. "Eleanor Grayson," the librarian continued. "Her spirit still haunts the house. They say she's angry. She wants something. Something that was taken from her." That night, Lisa returned to the house one last time. She knew she couldn't stay there, but she needed to see it again, to confirm the truth. The door was open when she arrived, despite having locked it when she left. The house was empty, but the cold, heavy air still hung in every room. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She turned to leave, but hesitated. There, in the reflection of the front door's glass, she saw the shadow of a little girl. "Leave," the girl whispered, her hollow eyes locking onto Lisa's. Lisa turned and ran. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The old house stood at the edge of the village, its faded stone walls overgrown with ivy and the paint on its shutters long gone, revealing the bare wood beneath. It had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, yet on clear nights when the wind howled through the trees, some said they could hear faint sounds coming from the house, creaking floors, the soft whisper of a door opening and closing, and sometimes the unmistakable sound of footsteps. For years, the story of the house had been little more than a village legend, passed down through generations. It was said that a family had lived there many years ago, a family who had mysteriously vanished one winter without a trace. Some claimed that the mother and father had gone mad, others that the children had died in a tragic accident. But no one knew the full truth. One cold autumn evening, when the harvest moon hung low in the sky, Lily and her friend Sarah found themselves walking home from the market. It was late, and the path they took led them close to the old house. They had always been curious, but also frightened by the eerie stories. This night, however, something was different. The house seemed to beckon to them, its broken windows reflecting the moonlight in strange patterns. "I dare you to go inside," Sarah said, a mischievous grin playing on her lips. Lily hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "No way. It's haunted." Sarah laughed, her voice light and teasing. "That's just what they say. You're not scared, are you?" Lily knew she couldn't back down now, not in front of Sarah. But the thought of stepping inside that house made her stomach churn. Still, she took a deep breath and walked toward the creaking iron gate. The gate, surprisingly, wasn't locked. It swung open with a groan, and Lily stepped through, followed by Sarah, who seemed far less worried than Lily felt. They approached the front door, which hung slightly ajar as though it had been waiting for them. The air around the house was colder than outside, a strange chill that seemed to seep into their bones. "Maybe we shouldn't do this," Lily muttered, but Sarah was already pushing the door open further. The house was darker than expected, the only light coming from the moon filtering in through the broken windows. The air smelled stale, like old dust and something more sinister. As they stepped inside, the floorboards creaked beneath their feet, sending a shiver up Lily's spine. She tried to brush it off as nerves, but the feeling of being watched made her heart race. "This is creepy," Sarah whispered, but she didn't seem scared at all. "Come on, let's look around." They explored the house room by room. Most of the furniture was still there, though covered in thick layers of dust. The walls were adorned with peeling wallpaper, and the ceilings were high, with faded chandeliers hanging from the rafters. Each room was colder than the last, the temperature dropping the deeper they went into the house. Eventually, they found themselves at the top of a narrow staircase that led to the attic. The door to the attic was partially open, and from inside came a faint, low sound, a soft tapping like fingernails on wood. Lily froze. "Did you hear that?" Sarah nodded, her face pale now. "Maybe it's just an animal." But something about the sound didn't sit right. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Lily could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Without thinking, Sarah stepped forward, pushing the door open. The stairs creaked under her weight, but she didn't seem to notice. Lily followed reluctantly, her heart pounding louder with each step. As they reached the top, the cold hit them harder than before, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. In the dim light of the attic, they could see what looked like a small figure hunched over in the far corner. It was a child, or at least it looked like one, sitting on the floor with its back to them. Its hair was long and tangled, and its clothes were tattered. Lily's breath caught in her throat. "What is that?" Sarah took a step forward, but Lily grabbed her arm. "Wait, don't go any closer." The figure turned slowly, revealing a face so pale it seemed almost translucent. Its eyes were wide and black, without pupils, staring directly at them with an intensity that made Lily's blood run cold. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence in the attic was thick, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Then, without warning, the figure stood up, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it began to shuffle toward them. Lily screamed, tugging Sarah's arm, but Sarah stood frozen, her eyes locked on the creature. The air around them seemed to warp, the temperature dropping even further. The figure's mouth stretched into a grotesque, unnatural smile, and Lily could see its teeth, long, yellowed, and sharp. "Run!" Lily shouted, pulling Sarah back down the stairs. They stumbled and nearly fell, but they didn't stop. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and Sarah bolted for the door, with Lily right behind her. The front door slammed shut with a deafening bang just as they reached it. They both turned, hearts racing, and saw that the door was now locked, trapping them inside. Panic set in as the sound of footsteps echoed through the house, slow, deliberate steps that grew louder with every passing second. They tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. Lily's hands were shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, but the footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. Lily and Sarah stood in the darkness, listening to the silence that followed. But it wasn't comforting. It was as if something was waiting for them, watching, listening. The door suddenly creaked open, but it wasn't the wind this time. Lily's heart skipped a beat as she saw a figure standing in the doorway, cloaked in shadows. It was tall, its features hidden by the darkness, but Lily could feel its presence, the same overwhelming sense of dread that had filled the attic. "Leave now." The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried with it a chilling authority. It was not a request. It was a command. Lily didn't hesitate. She grabbed Sarah's arm, and together they ran out of the house, not daring to look back. As they fled down the overgrown path and into the village, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. But the image of the figure, the pale face with its hollow eyes and twisted smile, stayed with them, haunting them. The next morning, Lily went back to the house alone, determined to confront whatever it was that had frightened her the night before. But when she arrived, the house was different. It was no longer decaying and abandoned. The shutters were newly painted, the ivy trimmed, and the front door freshly polished. A woman answered when she knocked, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a welcoming smile. She seemed completely ordinary, yet something about her felt wrong. "I'm sorry, I think I got confused," Lily stammered. "I thought this house had been empty for years." The woman smiled, but there was something unsettling about it. "This house has always been my home. Now, please, don't go bothering me again." Lily turned and left, but the encounter stayed with her. Something about the woman's smile made her skin crawl. As she walked away, she glanced back one last time. The woman was standing in the window, watching her, with those same hollow eyes, and in that moment, Lily knew she would never be the same. The house hadn't just been haunted by the past, it had been waiting for her. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The road to the cabin was long and winding, cutting through a dense forest that seemed to stretch on forever. Emma and her boyfriend Daniel had rented the isolated cabin for a weekend getaway. The idea was simple: escape the noise of the city, reconnect with nature, and enjoy each other's company in peace. The locals had warned them about the area, though not directly. When they mentioned the cabin to the gas station clerk, he'd hesitated, his expression guarded. "That place," he had muttered, trailing off before handing them their change. It wasn't the first uneasy look they'd gotten when mentioning the cabin, but neither Emma nor Daniel paid much attention. Superstitions weren't something they believed in. They arrived just before sunset, the last light of the day casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. It was small but cozy, with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and something faintly metallic, but it was warm and welcoming enough. Emma immediately loved the view of the dense forest through the large windows. As night fell, the quiet was almost unnerving. No distant hum of traffic, no chatter of neighbors, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. They built a fire in the hearth and settled in for the evening, laughing and drinking wine. By the time they went to bed, the odd tension Emma had felt earlier was nearly forgotten. But the first night was far from restful. Emma woke suddenly, her chest tight and her breath shallow. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. At first, she thought it was the unfamiliar environment making her uneasy, but then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like it was coming from outside, near the window. She nudged Daniel. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He groaned and rolled over. "It's just the wind," he mumbled, half asleep. Emma wasn't convinced. The tapping was too deliberate, too steady. She sat up in bed, straining to hear more. After a few moments, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The next morning, Emma mentioned the sound to Daniel, but he brushed it off. "Old cabins creak and make noises. Don't worry about it." Still, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. They spent the day hiking through the woods, exploring the trails that wove through the dense trees. By afternoon, Emma had almost managed to forget about the tapping. But as they walked back toward the cabin, she noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. On the path, just a few yards from the cabin, were footprints. They were small, like those of a child, and they were fresh. The odd thing was, there were no other signs of anyone nearby. No voices, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. "Daniel," she said, pointing at the prints, "do you see these?" He frowned. "Probably just some kids playing in the woods," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's head back." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to grow darker than the night before. The fire crackled in the hearth, and they tried to focus on a movie they'd downloaded but Emma kept glancing toward the windows. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching. When they went to bed, Emma struggled to fall asleep. Every creak of the cabin made her heart race. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. And then, in the dead of night, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It came from the same spot, near the window. Emma froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She reached out and shook Daniel awake. "Daniel, it's back," she whispered, her voice trembling. He sat up, groggy but alert. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. He frowned, grabbing his phone and turning on the flashlight. "Stay here," he said, climbing out of bed. Emma wanted to protest, to tell him not to go, but her voice caught in her throat. She watched as he walked to the window, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He pulled back the curtain, and for a moment, he just stood there, staring. Then he stepped back, his face pale. "What is it?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. "There's nothing there," he said, but she could see the fear in his eyes. "It's probably just the wind." But Emma knew he was lying. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, neither of them sleeping. By morning, the unease between them was palpable. Daniel suggested they pack up and leave, cutting their trip short, but Emma was reluctant. She didn't want to admit she was scared, didn't want to let a few strange noises ruin their weekend. But that afternoon, as they sat on the porch drinking coffee, something happened that neither of them could ignore. Emma saw it first, a figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line. It was small, childlike, but its features were indistinct. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching them. "Daniel," she whispered, her hand gripping his arm. "Do you see that?" He followed her gaze, his body tensing. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I see it." They both stood, their eyes fixed on the figure. Emma's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the trees. "That's it," Daniel said, grabbing her hand. "We're leaving." They packed their things in record time, neither of them speaking. As they loaded the car, Emma glanced back at the cabin one last time. In the upstairs window, she saw a face, a pale, shadowy face with hollow eyes staring down at her. She gasped, and when she blinked, it was gone. The drive back to the city was silent, both of them too shaken to talk. When they finally reached home, Emma felt a wave of relief. But that night, as she lay in her bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, about the figure in the woods, about the face in the window. And then she heard it. The tapping. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, and it was coming from her bedroom window. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The first time I saw the house, I knew there was something wrong with it. My wife, Claire, thought it was charming, a fixer-upper with character. I thought it looked haunted. The paint was peeling, the windows were clouded with grime, and the front porch sagged like the house was too tired to hold itself up. But it was cheap, and with the baby on the way, we needed space we could afford. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The day we moved in, the air felt heavy. Claire waved it off as humidity, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us. As we unpacked, I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that darted across the walls or slipped beneath the door frames. I told myself it was just nerves. A new house always felt strange at first. That night, after Claire fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. Around midnight, I heard something, a faint shuffling sound, like bare feet moving across the floorboards. I froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, then stopped outside our bedroom door. I held my breath, waiting. After a few minutes, I told myself it was nothing, maybe a draft or an animal in the walls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the other side of the door, listening. The next day, I found a pile of dirt in the hallway. It looked like it had been clawed up from between the floorboards. Claire laughed it off when I showed her. "Old houses are always like this," she said, brushing it away with a broom. But I noticed the way her hands trembled as she worked. The noises continued over the next few weeks. Footsteps in empty rooms, faint whispers that stopped the moment I strained to hear them. Claire seemed oblivious, but I could tell she was uneasy. She started sleeping with a lamp on, something she hadn't done since childhood. When I asked her about it, she shrugged and said, "It just feels safer, doesn't it?" One night, as I was coming up from the basement, I heard Claire talking in the nursery. Her voice was low and soothing, the way she spoke to the baby when she thought I wasn't listening. I smiled to myself and peeked through the crack in the door. She was sitting in the rocking chair, her hands resting on her pregnant belly. But she wasn't alone. A shadow stood in the corner of the room, tall and angular, its edges shimmering like heat waves. It leaned toward Claire, as if listening intently. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back, bumping into the wall. When I looked again, the shadow was gone. Claire glanced over her shoulder, startled. "What's wrong?" she asked. I shook my head. "Nothing," I lied. "I thought I heard something." That was the first time I saw it, but it wasn't the last. The shadow appeared more often after that, always lingering near Claire. It never seemed to notice me, but I could feel its presence, a cold, oppressive weight that filled the room. Claire started acting strangely. She spent hours in the nursery, talking to someone who wasn't there. When I asked her about it, she laughed and said, "I'm just talking to the baby." but the way her eyes darted away told me she was lying. One night I woke up to find her standing at the foot of the bed, staring down at me. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy. "Claire?" I whispered. She didn't respond. She just turned and walked out of the room. I followed her down the hallway, my heart pounding. She stopped in front of the nursery door and placed her hand on the doorknob. I grabbed her arm. "Claire, what are you doing?" She blinked, as if waking from a dream. I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I heard the baby crying." "There is no baby," I said gently. "Not yet." Her face crumpled, and she started to cry. I held her close, my own fear threatening to spill over. Something was wrong with the house, and it was getting worse. The final straw came a week later. I had just gotten home from work when I heard Claire screaming. I ran upstairs and found her in the nursery, standing in the center of the room. The rocking chair was moving on its own, back and forth, as if someone invisible was sitting in it. Claire pointed to the crib, her face white with terror. "It was in there," she whispered. "It was holding the baby." I didn't ask what she meant. I grabbed her hand and pulled her out of the room, slamming the door behind us. That night, we packed a bag and left the house. We didn't even stop to turn off the lights. We stayed with friends for a few days while we figured out what to do. When I went back to the house to collect our things, it felt different. The air was colder, heavier. The shadows seemed darker, deeper. I didn't stay long. As I was leaving, I glanced up at the nursery window. The shadow was there, watching me. We sold the house at a loss, desperate to be rid of it. I never told Claire about the shadow. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up and think I see it standing in the corner of our new bedroom, its edges shimmering like heat waves. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know it's still with us. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It started the night I moved into the small rental house on Ridgeview Lane. The house wasn't much, a single-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging roof. It sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, bordered by thick woods that seemed to whisper in the wind. For a freshly divorced woman like me, it was perfect. Affordable, secluded, and unassuming. I was ready for a fresh start, and this house seemed like the blank slate I needed. The first night passed without incident, aside from the creaks and groans of the old house settling. I told myself it was normal, just the noises of a structure adapting to the night's cool air. But as I lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, I felt a strange unease, like I wasn't alone. It was subtle, the kind of feeling you get when someone is standing behind you, even though you can't see them. I shrugged it off. Moving into a new place always came with jitters. The next day I noticed odd things. My keys, which I had left on the kitchen counter, were on the floor by the front door. A framed photo I'd placed on the mantel was lying face down. Small things easily explained. I was distracted and probably misplaced them myself. At least that's what I told myself. It was the third night when I first heard it, the soft, rhythmic tapping. It started around 2 a.m., waking me from a light sleep. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from outside, but from inside the house. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound seemed to be coming from the living room. Clutching my phone, I crept down the hallway, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet. The living room was empty. The tapping stopped as soon as I entered. I checked the windows, the doors, even the vents, but found nothing that could explain the noise. Feeling foolish, I went back to bed. As I pulled the covers over me, the tapping started again. By the end of the week, the tapping had escalated. It wasn't just at night anymore. It happened during the day, too. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It followed me from room to room, always just out of reach. My unease grew, but I didn't want to admit that something was wrong. I had spent months convincing myself that I was strong enough to rebuild my life. Admitting that my new home might be haunted felt like a step backward. Then I saw her. It was a Saturday evening, and I was unpacking a box of books in the living room. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. I turned to grab another book, and that's when I noticed her reflection in the window. A woman, standing in the hallway behind me. Her figure was faint, almost transparent, but I could make out the details. Long, dark hair that hung over her face, a tattered dress that looked soaked in water, and hands that dangled limply at her sides. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway was empty. When I turned back to the window, her reflection was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees outside made my skin crawl. I kept the lights on, clutching a flashlight like a lifeline. Over the next few days, the activity grew more intense. Doors slammed shut on their own. The lights flickered, even though I just replaced the bulbs. The air in the house felt heavy, oppressive. And then there were the dreams. Night after night, I dreamed of drowning, cold, dark water closing over my head, the pressure squeezing my chest. In the dreams, I could see her face, pale and bloated, her dead eyes locked on mine. I finally broke down and called the landlord. His voice was tight when I explained what had been happening. After a long pause, he said, "No one's lived there in a while. The last tenant, well, she had some troubles." "What kind of troubles?" I asked, gripping the phone. He hesitated. "Her name was Sarah. She lived there alone. A few months ago, she went missing. The police searched the area, but they never found her." I hung up, my hands trembling. I didn't need to ask what happened to her. I already knew. That night, I decided to leave. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my deposit. I just wanted out. I packed a bag and threw it in my car, planning to spend the night at a motel. But as I reached for the front door, it slammed shut in my face. I tried the back door, then the windows. They wouldn't budge. The house, it seemed, didn't want me to leave. The tapping started again, louder this time. It echoed through the house, coming from every direction. I backed into the living room, clutching my car keys like a weapon. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered before going out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. And then she was there. She stood at the far end of the hallway, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her dark hair dripped onto the floor, leaving wet stains on the carpet. Her hands twitched as she took a step toward me. "Leave," she whispered, her voice raspy and broken. "This is my house." I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table. My phone slipped from my hand, its screen shattering on the floor. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She was inches away now, her dead eyes boring into mine. "I'm sorry," I choked out. "I didn't know." Her expression softened just for a moment. Then, with a sudden rush of cold air, she was gone. The door unlocked itself. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, sprinted to my car, and didn't look back. I drove until the sun came up, finally pulling into the parking lot of a diner on the edge of town. I sat there for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. I never went back to the house on Ridgeview Lane. I didn't even return to collect my things. The landlord called a few times, but I let it go to voicemail. I couldn't bring myself to hear his voice or explain what I'd seen. I've tried to move on, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping. It's faint, almost imperceptible, but it's there. And I know she's still waiting, guarding her house. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The farmhouse stood alone at the end of a dirt road, flanked by sprawling fields and dense woods. It had been in our family for generations, passed down from one stubborn farmer to the next. I inherited it after my grandfather's death, a surprise to everyone, including me. I'd only visited the place once as a child and had no desire to return. But life in the city had become too expensive, and I needed a change. So on a brisk October morning, I packed my things and drove to the old farmhouse. The sight of it was both nostalgic and unsettling. The paint was peeling, the windows were smudged with grime, and the shutters hung askew. It was exactly as I remembered it, frozen in time, as if the house itself had never moved on from my grandfather's passing. The first few nights were uneventful. I busied myself with cleaning and unpacking, trying to ignore the eerie silence that enveloped the property. It wasn't until the fourth night that I noticed something strange. It started with the sounds, soft creaks and groans like footsteps on old wood. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through a box of my grandfather's belongings when I heard them. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but the noises were too deliberate, too rhythmic. They seemed to come from the upstairs hallway, directly above me. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The sounds stopped. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest. After a few moments, I convinced myself it was nothing. Old houses made noises, after all. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I found a picture frame lying on the floor in the hallway. It had been on the wall the night before, a sepia-toned photograph of my grandfather as a young man. The glass was cracked, and the frame was splintered as if it had been thrown. I picked it up, uneasy but determined to brush it off. Maybe it had fallen. Maybe the vibrations of my footsteps had loosened it from its nail. That's what I told myself, anyway. But then, there was the attic. I had avoided going up there since I moved in. The pull-down ladder looked rickety, and I wasn't eager to sort through decades of dusty junk. But one night as I lay in bed, I heard something. A faint scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floorboards above me. The attic. I stared at the ceiling, my throat dry. The sound came again, louder this time. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but curiosity and fear got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the hallway. The attic door loomed overhead, its edges outlined by faint moonlight streaming through a nearby window. I pulled the cord and the ladder creaked as it unfolded. The air that wafted down smelled of mildew and something metallic. I climbed up slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and tools. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, untouched for years. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, beneath a broken window, was an old rocking chair. It was moving. Not violently, but in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if someone were sitting in it. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. There was no breeze, no explanation for why it should be moving on its own. "Who's there?" I whispered. The chair stopped. I climbed back down, my hands shaking, and locked the attic door. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the house felt amplified. Each shadow seemed to stretch and move in ways it shouldn't. The next day, I found muddy footprints leading from the back door to the living room. They were small, like those of a child. The back door was locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. I cleaned them up, telling myself it was an animal, though I knew better. As the days passed, the activity escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own. Objects moved from one place to another. And always there were the sounds. Footsteps, whispers, the occasional soft laughter that made my skin crawl. One night I woke to the sound of the rocking chair creaking. It was loud, as if it were right outside my bedroom door. I sat up in bed, clutching the blankets, and that's when I saw her. A girl, no older than 8 or 9, standing at the foot of my bed. Her hair was matted, her dress torn and dirty. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to absorb the light. She tilted her head as if studying me, and then she smiled. "Leave," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. I blinked, and she was gone. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the farmhouse. I didn't care about the inheritance or the memories tied to the place. Whatever was in that house didn't want me there, and I wasn't about to fight it. I haven't been back since. Sometimes I dream about the girl, her hollow eyes, her chilling smile, and sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night, I think I hear the faint creak of a rocking chair. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
I moved into the old house on Willow Creek Road in the summer of 2018. It wasn't my first choice, but it was all I could afford after a rough breakup and a series of bad financial decisions. The house was a small, single-story structure with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. It had been on the market for years, and the real estate agent didn't seem particularly eager to talk about its history. "It's got character," she said vaguely as she handed me the keys. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I spent my time fixing up the place, replacing broken fixtures, painting the walls, and mowing the wild jungle of a lawn. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so. My nearest neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Clark, would wave from his porch but rarely spoke. Something about the way he looked at the house made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The first strange occurrence happened about a month after I moved in. It was late, around 2 a.m., and I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone. I heard a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and steady, coming from the living room. At first, I thought it was the branches of the old oak tree outside brushing against the window, but when I got up to check, the windows were closed, and the tree was nowhere near the house. I stood there for a moment, listening. The tapping stopped. I shrugged it off as the house settling and went back to bed, but something about it lingered in my mind. It wasn't a creak or a groan. It was deliberate, as though someone was knocking lightly on the wall. The next night, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder and seemed to move. It started in the living room, then shifted to the kitchen, then to the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, clutching the blankets. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. The tapping didn't return, but the air in the house felt heavier, almost suffocating. I left the light on and barely slept. Over the next few days, more things began to happen. Doors that I knew I had closed were suddenly open. Items I had placed on the kitchen counter, my keys, a coffee mug, would disappear, only to reappear in strange places. Once, I found my keys in the bathroom sink. Another time, I found the coffee mug sitting on the windowsill in the attic, a place I hadn't even gone yet. The attic was a space I avoided. The pull-down ladder was stiff with age, and the thought of going up there alone made my skin crawl. But one afternoon, I gathered my courage and just decided to investigate. I needed to know if there were animals or something else causing the disturbances. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with old furniture, boxes, and the faint smell of mildew. I shone my flashlight around, finding nothing out of the ordinary, until I saw it. In the far corner, partially obscured by a stack of boxes, was an old wooden rocking chair. It was moving, just slightly, as though someone had recently gotten up from it. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no breeze, no draft. The air was still and stifling, yet the chair creaked softly, rocking back and forth. I backed away slowly, not daring to turn my back on it, and climbed down the ladder, slamming the attic door shut behind me. That night, I dreamed of a woman. She was standing in the hallway, her back to me. Her hair was long and matted, her dress tattered and gray with age. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. When I tried to speak, she turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her face, pale, hollow, with dark, empty sockets where her eyes should have been. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The dream felt so real that I instinctively looked toward the hallway, half expecting to see her there. But the house was silent, too silent. The following morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the back door to the living room. They were small, like those of a child, and they stopped abruptly in front of the couch. The back door was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. I cleaned them up, but my hands were shaking the entire time. I decided to talk to Mr. Clark. If anyone knew about the house's history, it would be him. When I mentioned where I lived, his expression darkened. "You should have left that place alone," he said, his voice low. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. He sighed, looking past me as if debating whether to tell me. "A woman used to live there, decades ago. Her name was Margaret. She was quiet, kept to herself. People said she wasn't right in the head. One day her little boy disappeared. She swore he'd been taken, but no one believed her. They thought she'd done something to him. She locked herself in that house and never came out. They found her years later, dead in the attic. Some say she's still looking for him." I left Mr. Clark's house feeling cold and unsettled. His story explained a lot, but it didn't make me feel any better. That night, the activity in the house escalated. The whispers returned, louder this time, and I could almost make out words. The tapping turned into banging, and the rocking chair in the attic began creaking so loudly that I could hear it from the bedroom. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway toward my room. I locked the door and pressed myself against it, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside, and then I heard her. "Where is he?" The voice was raspy, filled with sorrow and rage. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't tell the landlord why. I just handed over the keys and never looked back. I moved into a small apartment across town and tried to put the whole experience behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of faint tapping on the walls. And when I close my eyes, I see her, standing in the hallway, waiting. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
I never believed in ghosts. I was a skeptic through and through until I moved into that house on Oak Street. It was a modest, two-story home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place people described as charming and cozy. The rent was reasonable, and I was desperate to get away from my cramped apartment in the city. The landlord, Mrs. Fairweather, was a sweet older woman who had lived in the house for decades before moving to a smaller place nearby. She said the house had been in her family for generations and had a long history of love. I remember her saying that with a smile, though there was something in her eyes that seemed almost too knowing. She told me that if I needed anything, to just knock on her door. But I never did, and at the time I thought nothing more of it. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked my things, set up a cozy living room, and enjoyed the peace that came with having a place of my own. There was something soothing about the creaky floors and the old fireplace that made the house feel warm, even on the colder nights. I was settling in, adjusting to my new life. It wasn't until the fourth night that things started to get strange. I had just gotten into bed, ready for sleep, when I heard something faint coming from the hallway. It sounded like footsteps, soft and deliberate, as though someone was walking slowly down the stairs. I sat up, my heart racing, but when I looked down the hallway, there was no one there. The house was quiet again, the only sound coming from the wind rustling the leaves outside. I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was just the house settling. Old houses made strange noises, right? The next night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder and closer. I could hear them moving down the hallway and stopping outside my bedroom door. My pulse quickened, and I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The footsteps disappeared, and the house fell silent once again. I didn't sleep much that night. The pattern continued for days. The footsteps would come at night, always the same, slow, deliberate, and always stopping at my door. I started locking my bedroom door at night, but it didn't help. The footsteps would still come, like an invisible presence walking around me in the dark. One night, I even gathered the courage to get out of bed and search the house. I checked every room, every closet, even the attic, but there was no one there. Just empty rooms and the creeping sense that something was watching me. By the end of the week, I was exhausted. The lack of sleep was wearing on me, and the fear I felt every time the footsteps came was beginning to take its toll. I tried to talk myself out of it. Maybe it was an animal in the walls, or the house itself was just old and making sounds. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was in that house with me. One evening, after another sleepless night, I decided to confront it. I stood in the hallway, near the stairs, where the footsteps always started. My heart pounded in my chest, my palms sweaty. I called out into the empty air. "Who's there?" I demanded. "Show yourself." For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched out, and I felt foolish standing there, waiting for an answer. But then, just as I turned to walk away, I heard it, a whisper, soft and eerie, like someone was right behind me. "Get out." I froze. The voice was faint, almost a hiss, but the words were clear. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing. Just the dark, quiet hallway. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I was shaken to the core. The footsteps, the whispers, whatever it wasn't going to let me live in peace. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend, telling myself I would come back later to gather my things. But as I was about to leave, something stopped me. It was the same feeling I had had when I first moved in, the feeling that the house was watching me, that it knew what I was thinking. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, unsure of what to do. Then, on a whim, I decided to take a look in the attic. I hadn't been up there since I moved in, and I wondered if maybe there was something hidden away that I hadn't noticed. I needed answers, even if I wasn't sure I wanted them. I pulled down the ladder, the wood creaking under my weight. The attic was dark, the air stale, and the floor covered in dust. I shone my flashlight around, trying to get a sense of the space. There was a lot of old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings that I didn't recognize. But something caught my eye, a small wooden chest tucked away in the corner, nearly buried beneath a pile of old blankets. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. When I opened the chest, I found an assortment of old photographs, letters, and a small book. The photos were all of a young woman, pretty, with long brown hair and a smile that seemed too bright for her eyes. She looked like she belonged to another time. The letters were dated from the early 1900s, written in flowing cursive. I skimmed through them quickly, not sure what I was looking for, until I found one that stopped me cold. It was addressed to the woman in the photos, written by someone named Eleanor. The letter spoke of a tragedy, of a young man named Thomas who had been lost, and of Eleanor's fear that the woman, whose name I never learned, had gone mad after his disappearance. The last line of the letter read, "She never left the house. She waits for him still. I fear what she has become." A chill ran through me, and I dropped the letter. I suddenly understood everything. The footsteps, the whispers, the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. The house wasn't just old, it was haunted by something tragic, something that had never left. I didn't need to read the rest of the letters. I didn't need to know any more. I left the attic, grabbed my things, and never went back to that house. I moved into another apartment, far from Oak Street, and tried to forget about what happened. But sometimes, when the night is still and quiet, I hear it. The faintest of footsteps, the softest of whispers, like someone is walking just behind me, urging me to return. Story the end.
Story number 11.
I moved into the house on Crestwood Lane in the fall, hoping to turn over a new leaf. The house was small, tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac with a sprawling backyard surrounded by woods. It had been vacant for a while, but the rent was cheap, and I needed a place to escape the chaos of the city. The realtor mentioned it had been on the market for years, but she was vague about why. I didn't ask questions. I just wanted peace and quiet. The first week passed without incident. I spent my days unpacking, cleaning, and settling into the rhythm of small-town life. The house had its quirks, floorboards that creaked, doors that stuck, but I chalked it up to age. The neighbors were friendly but distant, offering polite waves from across the street but little else. I didn't mind. I wasn't looking for friends. It started one night when I was sitting in the living room, reading a book. The air had grown colder, despite the heater running. At first, I thought it was just the weather, but then I noticed the sound, faint and rhythmic, like someone walking down the hallway. The floorboards creaked under the weight of invisible footsteps. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. The footsteps stopped. I stood, heart pounding, and slowly walked toward the hallway. It was empty, of course. Just the shadows cast by the dim light of the living room lamp. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. Houses made noises. That was all it was. But the footsteps came back the next night. This time, they didn't stop when I called out. They moved through the hallway, into the kitchen, and then back toward the bedroom. I followed the sound, clutching a flashlight, but I saw nothing. The air in the house felt heavy, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The footsteps were louder, more deliberate, and then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to echo through the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger. Whoever or whatever it was, they didn't want me there. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, stretching across the walls in impossible shapes. Objects began to disappear, my keys, a coffee mug, a framed photo of my parents, only to reappear in strange places. I found the photo one morning, propped up on the windowsill of the attic, a place I hadn't even been yet. The attic door had been painted shut, but that morning it was slightly ajar. A draft wafted down from the opening, carrying with it the scent of mildew and something metallic. I stood at the base of the pull-down ladder, staring up into the darkness. Every instinct told me not to go up there, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense that the answers were waiting for me in that attic. I climbed up, the ladder groaning under my weight. The attic was small and cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the beam of my flashlight. I saw nothing unusual at first, just the typical detritus of a home left to decay. And then I found the box. It was tucked away in the corner, covered with a sheet of yellowed newspaper. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. They were old, black and white, and all of the same woman. She was beautiful, with dark hair and piercing eyes, but there was something unsettling about her expression. In every photo, she stared directly at the camera, her face devoid of emotion. At the bottom of the box was a leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle, the handwriting spidery and faint. Most of it was mundane, a record of daily life in the house. But as I flipped through, the entries grew darker. The noises started again last night, footsteps in the hallway, whispers in the dark. I don't think I'm alone here. She's angry. I don't know what I did, but she won't leave me alone. I saw her today. She was standing at the foot of my bed, just staring at me. I can't take this anymore. The final entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. She's here. A loud bang echoed from below, jolting me out of my thoughts. I dropped the journal, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound had come from the living room. Heart racing, I climbed down the ladder and cautiously made my way downstairs. The living room was empty, but the air was ice cold. The television turned on by itself, the screen flickering with static. A figure appeared in the static, a woman. Her face was blurry, but her eyes were sharp, focused, staring directly at me. "Get out," she whispered, her voice crackling through the speakers. The screen went dark. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, clutching the journal, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I didn't care about the lease or the money I'd spent moving in. I just wanted to be far away from that house. As I packed my things, I noticed something strange. The journal was gone. I searched everywhere, but it had vanished, as if it had never existed. The photographs were gone too, the box in the attic empty. I left the house that afternoon, leaving behind everything I couldn't fit into my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent and empty, its windows dark and uninviting. But in the attic window, I saw her, the woman from the photographs. She was watching me, her expression unreadable. I've never gone back to Crestwood Lane. I never even called the landlord to explain why I left. Sometimes late at night, I think about the journal and the final chilling entry, "She's here." And sometimes, when the house is quiet and the shadows grow long, I swear I can still hear footsteps. Story the end.
Story number 12.
Here's a chilling ghost story that feels true to life. It started with the letter. Emily found it tucked into an old, weathered book she had purchased from a secondhand shop on a rainy Saturday afternoon. The book smelled of mildew and carried a strange, lingering coldness, as though it had been left in a damp basement for decades. Emily wasn't the kind of person who believed in the supernatural, but something about the letter's fragile paper and faded ink gave her pause. The words were written in a shaky, almost desperate hand. "Whoever finds this, please help me. I am trapped in the house on Galloway Road. They won't let me leave. Tell someone. Burn this book. Please." Emily frowned. She had lived in the small, quiet town of Wrensford for most of her life. She knew of Galloway Road. It was a desolate stretch of cracked asphalt on the outskirts of town, lined with empty fields and scattered trees. There was only one house there, a dilapidated Victorian with peeling paint and sagging walls, long abandoned after its last owner passed away. Curiosity pricked at her, even as unease settled deep in her chest. Who had written this letter? And why? Emily folded it carefully, slipping it into her pocket. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just some strange prank. The next day, the skies hung heavy with gray clouds, and a biting wind howled through the bare trees. Emily drove out to Galloway Road, the old book sitting on the passenger seat as if it were her only companion. The house loomed in the distance like a shadow, its once grand frame hunched and broken against the sky. The closer she got, the colder it seemed to grow. By the time she parked in front of the house, her breath fogged the air. She hesitated on the threshold, the rotted wood creaking under her feet. The air inside was damp and heavy, smelling of decay and something sour she couldn't quite place. Dust floated in thick clouds, disturbed by her movements. The house was silent, yet it felt alive, watching her, breathing with her. She wandered from room to room, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. The wallpaper peeled in jagged strips, and old furniture sat where it had been abandoned, as though its owners had vanished without warning. It was in the sitting room that she saw it, a mirror, cracked down the middle, leaning against the far wall. As Emily approached, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like an invisible hand pressing against her chest. Her reflection looked normal at first, her wide eyes, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. But then it changed. The face in the mirror twisted, the mouth opening wide in a silent scream. It wasn't her anymore. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken into her skull. Her lips moved, forming words Emily couldn't hear. Emily stumbled backward, the letter slipping from her fingers. She wanted to run, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. "Please," a voice whispered, so faint it was almost swallowed by the creak of the house. Emily turned sharply, her heart hammering. The voice didn't come from the mirror. It came from the corner of the room where the shadows seemed darker, deeper. "Who's there?" she demanded, though her voice trembled. The shadows shifted, and for a moment Emily thought she saw the outline of a figure, a woman, thin and frail, with hair that hung in damp strands around her face. "Help me," the voice said again, louder this time. Emily's instincts screamed at her to leave, but something about the desperation in the voice held her in place. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Clara," the voice replied. "They trapped me here. They won't let me go." Emily's breath caught. "Who trapped you?" Clara didn't answer. Instead, the shadows began to spread, crawling along the walls like living things. The air grew colder, and Emily's skin prickled with fear. "Leave," Clara said suddenly, her voice sharp. "They know you're here." Emily turned and ran, her feet slipping on the dusty floor. The house groaned around her, the walls seeming to close in. She burst through the front door, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until she reached her car. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her dreams were filled with images of the house, the woman in the mirror, the shadows that moved like living things. When she woke, the letter was on her nightstand, even though she was certain she had dropped it in the house. The words had changed. "You shouldn't have come." Emily's hands shook as she stared at the letter. She wanted to forget what had happened, to pretend it was all a bad dream. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was still trapped in that house, waiting for someone to help her. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered in her apartment, even when there was no storm. Doors opened and closed on their own. And at night, she heard whispers, faint, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Emily knew she had to go back. She couldn't explain why, but she felt a pull toward the house, as though it had claimed her somehow. When she returned to Galloway Road, the sky was dark and heavy with the promise of rain. She carried a flashlight, a can of gasoline, and a box of matches. If Clara wanted the house burned, Emily was going to do it. The house greeted her with its usual oppressive silence. She made her way to the sitting room where the mirror still stood, its surface cracked and grimy. "Clara?" she called out, her voice trembling. The shadows in the corner shifted, and Clara appeared again, her form barely visible. "You came back," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "I'm going to help you," Emily said. Clara shook her head. "It's too late. They're here." The air grew colder, and the shadows began to move again, spreading like ink across the walls. Emily's flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers started, low and guttural, surrounding her from all sides. She could feel them, things moving in the dark, their presence heavy and suffocating. "Run," Clara whispered, her voice urgent. But Emily couldn't move. Something cold and clawed wrapped around her wrist, pulling her toward the shadows. She screamed, struggling to break free, but it was no use. The last thing she saw, before everything went black, was Clara, her face filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to bleed into the walls. Emily woke hours later, lying in the overgrown grass outside the house. The book was gone, as was the letter. The house stood silent, empty, as though nothing had ever happened. She never went back to Galloway Road, but the whispers followed her. They came at night, when the world was quiet, filling her dreams with shadows and cold, clawing hands. She tried to move on, to forget what had happened. But some nights she thought she could see Clara's face in the mirror, her mouth forming the same desperate plea. "Help me." Story the end.
Story number 13.
The rain started just as Michael turned onto the gravel road that led to the old farmhouse. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the headlights of his car illuminating the narrow path ahead. The place was a relic of his childhood, a house his family had abandoned years ago, shortly after his father's death. Michael hadn't been back since. Now, with his mother gone, the farmhouse was his. He'd come to clear it out, to decide whether to sell or keep it. The memories of this place were murky at best, shadowed by the trauma of his father's sudden passing. But Michael was determined to face whatever ghosts lingered there, figurative or otherwise. The house was exactly as he remembered it, yet smaller. The paint had peeled away in patches and the porch sagged under the weight of neglect. He turned off the car engine, stepping out into the downpour with a flashlight in hand. The air smelled of wet earth and decay. As he pushed open the front door, it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. The inside was musty, filled with the scent of mildew and aged wood. His flashlight beam danced across the living room, revealing old furniture draped in white sheets, like shrouded figures frozen in time. Michael set his duffel bag down and exhaled deeply. Just a weekend, he muttered to himself. Sort through the boxes, take what's valuable, and go. The first night was uneventful, though the house felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were watching him. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the cracks in the windows. He tried to sleep in the old bedroom upstairs, but every creak of the floorboards made his pulse quicken. He eventually dozed off, but his dreams were restless and strange, shadows moving in corners, faint whispers that he couldn't understand. The next day, Michael began sorting through the attic. It was packed with boxes of old photographs, books, and knickknacks that his mother had refused to part with. He found a box labeled Dad's Things and hesitated before opening it. Inside were faded Polaroids, his father's watch, and a stack of journals. The sight of them stirred something in him, a mix of sadness and unease. As he flipped through the journals, he noticed that the entries grew darker toward the end. His father had written about hearing noises at night, about seeing shadows move through the house. He described waking up to the sound of footsteps outside his bedroom door, only to find no one there. Michael frowned, his chest tightening. His father had been a practical man, not one to indulge in fantasies or superstitions. Reading his words felt like peering into a side of him Michael had never known. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael decided to take a break. He lit a fire in the old stone hearth and sat on the dusty couch, sipping from a flask he'd brought. The fire's crackle was the only sound in the otherwise silent house. But then he heard it, a faint knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, coming from the front door. Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. The house was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the road was too muddy for a casual visitor. He set down the flask and stood, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. The knock came again, louder this time. Slowly he approached the door, his heart pounding. When he opened it, the porch was empty. The rain had stopped and the night was eerily still. "Hello?" he called out, stepping outside. The only response was the distant chirp of crickets. He scanned the yard with his flashlight but saw nothing. Shaking his head, he went back inside and locked the door. "Just the wind," he muttered, though he didn't believe it. That night the noises began. Michael was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps overhead. He lay still, his body tense, as the sound moved across the ceiling, stopping across the ceiling, directly above his bed. His mind raced. Had someone followed him here? Was someone hiding in the attic? He grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand and climbed out of bed, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The house was silent now, but his gut told him he wasn't alone. He climbed the stairs to the attic, each step creaking under his weight. When he reached the top, he hesitated before pushing the door open. The attic was empty, just as he had left it. The boxes were undisturbed, the air thick with the smell of dust and time. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something odd. A single, wet footprint in the middle of the floor. Michael's stomach dropped. The footprint was small, like that of a child. He shone his flashlight around the room, but saw no other prints. Fighting the urge to panic, he returned to his room and locked the door. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, Michael resolved to finish his work quickly and leave. He spent the day packing up items to take back to the city, trying to ignore the lingering sense of unease. But as night fell, the house seemed to come alive. It started with the footsteps again, soft and deliberate, moving through the upstairs hallway. Then came the whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to drift through the walls. Michael tried to drown them out with music, but the static on the radio grew louder until it was all he could hear. And then the knocking returned. This time it wasn't at the door, it was coming from inside the house. Michael followed the sound to the basement door, which was slightly ajar. He hadn't been down there yet, hadn't even thought about it. But now the sound was persistent, as though someone or something was trying to get his attention. Against his better judgment, Michael opened the door. The basement stairs descended into darkness, the air cold and damp. He shone his flashlight down, illuminating the stone walls and the dirt floor. The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, but he thought he saw movement in the shadows. Swallowing his fear, he stepped down the stairs, his flashlight beam shaking. When he reached the bottom, the air felt heavier, as though the basement were pressing down on him. In the corner of the room, something glinted, a small metal object half buried in the dirt. He knelt to pick it up, his hands trembling. It was a locket. Michael's breath caught as he opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph of a young girl he didn't recognize. The back of the locket was engraved with a name, Clara. Before he could process what he was holding, the flashlight flickered and went out. Panic surged through him as he fumbled with the switch, his breaths coming in short gasps. In the pitch black, he heard it, a faint giggle, high-pitched and chilling. He bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind him. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely lock it. The giggle echoed in his mind, a sound he knew he'd never forget. That night, Michael didn't sleep. He sat in the living room with every light in the house on, clutching his father's journal. As he flipped through the pages again, he found an entry he hadn't noticed before. "She's still here," his father had written in shaky handwriting. "Clara won't leave. She says it's her house now." Michael's blood ran cold. He looked at the locket in his hand, the photograph of the girl smiling up at him. He didn't know who she was, but he knew he couldn't stay. By dawn, Michael had packed his car and was ready to leave. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The farmhouse stood silent and empty, its windows dark. But as he turned onto the main road, he thought he saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, a small girl with hollow eyes watching him go. Story the end.
Story number 14.
When I first moved into the small one-bedroom apartment on Oak Street, it felt perfect. It was old but cozy, with hardwood floors and tall windows that let in plenty of light. The rent was cheap, and the landlord, Mrs. Hawthorne, seemed nice enough, though she had a peculiar habit of avoiding eye contact. She handed me the keys and muttered, "If you hear anything strange, just ignore it." I laughed awkwardly, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. The first night was quiet, apart from the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of traffic outside. I unpacked late into the evening, filling the shelves with books and setting up the small kitchen. By midnight, I was exhausted and collapsed into bed, feeling relieved to finally have a place of my own. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of faint knocking. It was soft and rhythmic, like someone tapping on a window. I sat up, groggy and confused, and listened. The knocking stopped. I assumed it was the wind or maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But when I checked the windows the next morning, there were no trees nearby. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. The second night, the knocking came again. This time it was louder and seemed to move. First, it was at the bedroom window. Then it was near the front door. I turned on every light in the apartment and searched, but no one was there. My skin prickled with unease, but I convinced myself it had to be the pipes or some other quirk of the old building. By the third night, the knocking was accompanied by something worse. As I lay in bed, I heard faint whispers. At first, I thought it was coming from the hallway outside my apartment, but when I pressed my ear to the door, I realized it was coming from inside. The whispers were low, almost too quiet to make out, but the tone was unmistakably angry. I felt my chest tighten and my hands shook as I backed away from the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch with all the lights on, clutching my phone. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who could I tell? My friends would think I was losing it, and the landlord had already made that strange comment when I moved in. I decided to wait until morning and figure out what to do. The next day, I noticed something strange in the bathroom. The mirror above the sink was fogged up, as if someone had taken a hot shower. I hadn't used the shower that morning. In the fog, there were faint streaks, like finger marks. My stomach twisted as I leaned closer. The streaks formed words, "Get out." I stumbled back, my heart racing. I grabbed my keys and left the apartment, spending the day at a coffee shop downtown. I debated not going back at all, but I had nowhere else to go. By the time I returned that evening, the mirror was clear and the apartment seemed normal again. I convinced myself that I was just stressed or overtired, and maybe I had made the marks myself without realizing it. That night, the air in the apartment felt different, heavier, colder. I turned on the heat, but it didn't help. As I lay in bed, trying to ignore the unease creeping over me, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a laugh, not a cheerful laugh, but a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to echo through the room. I sat up, clutching the blanket to my chest. The laugh came again, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. And then I saw it. In the corner of the bedroom near the closet stood a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its body cloaked in shadow. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a dark void, as if the light refused to touch it. It tilted its head as if studying me, and then it spoke. "You don't belong here." The voice was deep and guttural, resonating in a way that made my bones ache. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stepped closer, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I felt tears streaming down my face as I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The room was silent, but the air still felt cold and heavy. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I packed a bag and left the apartment. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd come back later to figure out what was going on. But deep down, I knew I couldn't stay there. I called Mrs. Hawthorne from my car, demanding answers. At first, she was hesitant, but eventually, she sighed and said, "You should have left it alone." "Left what alone?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The apartment. The last tenant. She died there. No one knows how, but after that, strange things started happening. People would move in and leave within days. I thought maybe it had stopped." "Why didn't you tell me?" I shouted. She didn't respond, but I could hear the guilt in her silence. I never went back to the apartment. A moving company collected my things, and I found another place to live. Smaller, more expensive, but safe. I've tried to forget about the apartment on Oak Street, but sometimes late at night I wake up to the sound of faint knocking on my bedroom window. And when I look, there's nothing there. Story the end.
Story number 15.
It started with the whispers. At first they were faint, barely discernible murmurs carried by the wind that rattled the loose shutters of the old farmhouse. Claire thought it was her imagination. After all, the house was ancient, creaking and groaning under the weight of decades. But then the whispers grew louder. She had inherited the house from her grandmother, who passed away unexpectedly last fall. Nestled deep in the countryside, surrounded by dense woods, it was the kind of place that oozed charm and unease in equal measure. Claire was drawn to it despite its peeling paint, cracked windows, and the lingering smell of must and damp. She told herself she'd renovate it, make it her own, and find solace away from the chaos of city life. The first night, she noticed the cold spots. The upstairs hallway was particularly icy, even though the thermostat read a comfortable 72 degrees. She brushed it off, attributing it to poor insulation. But when she stood there too long, she felt the prickle of static on her skin, as if the air itself didn't want her there. By the third night, Claire started hearing the footsteps. They came at odd hours, echoing softly on the warped wooden floors. At first, she thought it was raccoons in the attic. She grabbed a flashlight and investigated, but found nothing. Yet the footsteps persisted, pacing the length of the hallway above her room. It wasn't until the fifth night that she saw the shadow. Claire was lying in bed, scrolling through her phone, when something dark flitted across the corner of her vision. She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly, she turned her head toward the doorway. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but there was movement, a faint, almost imperceptible shape shifting in the dark. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty hallway. But as she panned the light back toward her room, she swore she saw a figure slipping into the adjacent guest bedroom. Claire didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room with every light in the house turned on, clutching her grandmother's old brass candlestick as a makeshift weapon. The next morning, she called her friend Eric, a skeptic to the core. He laughed when she told him about the shadow. Old houses make weird noises, Claire. Shadows are just tricks of the light. You've been watching too many horror movies. But Claire wasn't convinced. She could feel something was wrong with the house, something that wasn't just creaky floorboards or drafty windows. That night, she decided to confront it. Armed with a bottle of wine and a nervous determination, she stayed awake until the footsteps began. This time, they were heavier, more deliberate. They didn't just pace, they stopped outside her bedroom door. Her breath hitched as the door creaked open an inch. "Who's there?" she demanded, gripping the candlestick so tightly her knuckles turned white. No answer. She leapt out of bed and flung the door wide open. The hallway was empty, but the guest bedroom door was ajar. Swallowing her fear, Claire stepped into the room. The air was thick, suffocating. Her flashlight caught the outline of an antique rocking chair in the corner, one she didn't remember being there before. It swayed gently, as if someone had just been sitting in it. "Show yourself," she shouted, her voice cracking. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the whispers returned. But this time they weren't faint. They were all around her, overlapping and indistinct. A cacophony of voices filled the room, rising to a deafening pitch. Claire covered her ears, but it didn't help. And then silence. The chair stopped rocking. Claire stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. That's when she saw it. Carved into the wooden floorboards beneath the chair was a name, Eleanor. The next day, Claire went into town to the local library, desperate for answers. She dug through old records, searching for anything about the house or the Eleanor. What she found chilled her to the bone. In 1923, a woman named Eleanor Grayson had lived in the house. She was a recluse, known for her strange rituals and obsession with the occult. Rumors swirled about her practicing dark magic, but no one could prove it. One day she vanished without a trace. The townsfolk assumed she had left, but whispers persisted that her spirit never did. Claire returned to the house as dusk fell, her mind racing. She decided to leave, to sell the house and never look back. But when she stepped inside, the air felt heavier, oppressive. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, alive. That night, the activity escalated. The whispers turned into guttural growls. The footsteps became a relentless march, and the rocking chair swayed violently, as if something unseen was thrashing in it. Claire locked herself in the bedroom, trembling. She dialed Eric's number, but the call wouldn't go through. Her phone screen flickered, then died. And then the knocking began. It came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, everywhere at once. The sound grew louder and more frantic until Claire screamed, "Leave me alone." The knocking stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then the door to her room flew open with a force that shattered the hinges. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall, gaunt, and wreathed in shadows. Its face was a blur, constantly shifting, but its eyes were black voids that seemed to pull her in. Claire couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The figure stepped closer, its skeletal hand reaching out. The whispers filled the room again, but now they formed words, clear and menacing. "Get out!" Claire didn't need to be told twice. She bolted past the figure, out of the house, and into the night. She never returned. Weeks later, the farmhouse burned to the ground. The fire department couldn't determine the cause, but the locals had their theories. They said it was Eleanor, finally putting an end to whatever tethered her spirit to the old house. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, the townsfolk swear they can still hear the whispers. Story the end.
Story number 16.
The cabin wasn't supposed to be frightening. Tucked away in the dense woods of the Adirondacks, it was a rustic retreat where Lily could finally get some quiet. After weeks of deadlines at work, she'd craved a few days away from the endless notifications and chatter of the city. The cabin belonged to a distant cousin of her mother, who offered it to Lily for the weekend. It had no Wi-Fi, limited cell service, and a wood-burning stove for heat. Exactly what she thought she needed. When she arrived late Friday afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun cast a warm glow on the clearing where the cabin sat. It was small but well kept, with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch. The woods surrounding it seemed almost alive, the towering trees whispering in the autumn wind. Inside, the cabin was cozy, with knotty pine walls and a faint smell of cedar. A note on the kitchen table welcomed her, written in loopy handwriting. Enjoy your stay. Don't forget to latch the cellar door. It tends to swing open when it's windy. Marjorie. Lily smiled at the quaintness of it all. She put away her groceries, poured herself a glass of wine, and settled in for the evening. The quiet was unnerving at first. Without the background noise of the city, every creak of the cabin and rustle of the trees outside seemed amplified. But after a while, the stillness grew comforting. That night, she slept deeply, undisturbed by the usual blare of car horns or the glow of streetlights. It wasn't until early morning that she was jolted awake by a sound, a faint, rhythmic thump, thump. Disoriented, Lily sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The sound was distant but deliberate, like someone knocking slowly on wood. She strained her ears, trying to pinpoint its source. After a few moments, it stopped. Convincing herself it was the wind, or maybe a branch tapping against the side of the cabin, Lily lay back down. But sleep didn't come easily, and when morning light finally seeped through the curtains, she felt uneasy. Over breakfast, she inspected the outside of the cabin, looking for anything that could explain the noise. The trees closest to the house weren't tall enough to reach the windows, and the porch was clear of debris. Shrugging it off, she decided to go for a hike and clear her mind. The woods were stunning, the ground carpeted with fallen leaves in shades of gold and crimson. She followed a trail that looped around a small lake, the air crisp and fresh. By the time she returned to the cabin, the sun was sinking low, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and thin. As she approached the porch, something caught her eye. The cellar door, which was built into the ground at the side of the cabin, was ajar. She remembered Marjorie's note and frowned. Had she forgotten to latch it the night before? Kneeling, she pulled the heavy door shut and slid the rusty latch into place. The cellar smelled damp, and she wrinkled her nose at the faint odor of earth and decay that wafted up. A chill ran down her spine, though the evening wasn't particularly cold. That night, the noise returned. Lily had been reading by the fire when she heard it again, the same steady thump, thump, thump. This time it was closer, seeming to come from beneath the floorboards. Her breath hitched as she froze, listening intently. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. She told herself it was nothing, probably just the house settling. But deep down, she didn't believe it. The unease that had been lingering since her arrival was growing, clawing at her rational mind. Determined not to let her imagination get the better of her, Lily went to bed, pulling the covers up to her chin like a child afraid of the dark. She left the bedside lamp on, its warm glow a small comfort. In the dead of night, she woke again. This time, it wasn't the knocking that roused her, but something else. A soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was faint, but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the cellar. Her heart raced as she lay still, her ears straining. The scraping grew louder, more frantic, then stopped altogether. She stared at the ceiling, her body rigid with fear. Minutes passed, then hours, but the sound didn't return. By morning, Lily was exhausted. She paced the cabin, debating whether to cut her trip short. But the idea of running home to the city, of letting her fear win, felt ridiculous. She'd always prided herself on her practicality, her ability to face things head-on. Resolving to investigate, she grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped outside. The cellar door was latched just as she'd left it, but the dirt around it seemed disturbed. Small, shallow grooves marred the ground as though something had been clawing at it. She knelt to get a closer look, her stomach churning. The marks weren't animal tracks. There were no paw prints, no signs of wildlife. They looked almost like handprints. A wave of nausea rolled over her as she stood abruptly, backing away from the cellar. She told herself it was her imagination, that she was reading too much into a few scratches in the dirt, but she couldn't bring herself to open the door. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety. She avoided the cellar, trying to distract herself with books and movies. But as darkness fell, her nerves frayed. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That night, the sounds returned with a vengeance. The knocking was louder, more insistent, and the scraping was joined by something else. A low, guttural moan that made her blood run cold. It echoed through the cabin, filling every corner with its unearthly resonance. Lily sat huddled on the couch, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. She wanted to flee, to jump in her car and never look back, but she was paralyzed by fear. The moaning grew louder, rising to a wail that seemed to come from the very walls. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by Lily's ragged breaths. She stayed on the couch until the first light of dawn seeped through the windows, too terrified to move. When morning came, she didn't hesitate. She packed her things in record time, leaving the dishes unwashed and the bed unmade. As she loaded her bags into the car, she glanced toward the cellar one last time. The door was wide open. Her throat tightened as she stared at the dark maw leading into the ground. Something moved inside, just a flicker, a shadow shifting in the gloom. She didn't wait to see more. Lily slammed the car door and sped down the gravel road, her tires kicking up dirt and leaves. She didn't stop driving until she was miles away, the cabin a distant memory in her rearview mirror. She never went back, though she sometimes dreamed of the cellar. In her dreams, the door was always open, and something was always waiting just beyond the threshold. Story the end.
Story number 17.
The house had been on the market for years. A rambling Victorian nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was the kind of place that should have sold quickly. Yet it sat untouched, as though no one dared to claim it. Jenna didn't care about the rumors. The price was right, the space was perfect, and she needed a fresh start. After her divorce, she craved a home where she could rebuild her life. The real estate agent, a woman in her 60s with a tight smile, had hesitated before handing over the keys. "People talk," the agent said, her voice low. "They say the house is peculiar. You'll hear noises, things will move, but there's nothing to it. Old houses settle." Jenna nodded politely, but she dismissed the warning. She wasn't superstitious. Her only ghosts were the memories she was leaving behind. The first week passed uneventfully. The house was drafty, sure, and the floorboards creaked underfoot, but that was expected in a house built in the late 1800s. Jenna spent her days unpacking, painting, and arranging furniture. At night, she'd curl up with a book or scroll mindlessly on her phone, soothed by the quiet. It wasn't until the second week that she noticed something odd. She'd been unpacking a box of dishes in the kitchen when she heard a faint knock. It wasn't coming from the front door, but from somewhere inside the house. She froze, listening. The knock came again, rhythmic and deliberate. She followed the sound, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The knocking led her to the dining room, where an antique china cabinet stood against the wall. She hadn't paid much attention to it when she moved in. It came with the house and looked too heavy to bother moving. The glass doors of the cabinet reflected her puzzled face as she approached. The knocking stopped. She opened the cabinet, revealing dusty shelves lined with chipped porcelain plates and tarnished silverware. Nothing seemed out of place. Shaking her head, she chalked it up to the house settling. That night, she locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and went to bed. The next morning, the dining room was freezing. Jenna shivered as she walked through, noticing that the air felt colder near the china cabinet. When she reached out to touch it, the wood was icy under her fingertips. She checked the windows nearby. They were closed tight. "Probably just a draft," she muttered to herself. But as the days went on, the noises became harder to ignore. Soft footsteps echoed in the upstairs hallway when she was alone in the kitchen. Doors creaked open that she was certain she'd closed. And always there was that faint knocking coming from the same place, the china cabinet. One night, unable to sleep, Jenna decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and a screwdriver and set to work dismantling the cabinet. It wasn't easy. The screws were rusted and the wood groaned as she pried at it. But after an hour, she managed to remove the back panel. Behind it, she found a small, hollow space. Nestled inside was a bundle wrapped in yellowed cloth. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing a child's porcelain doll. Its painted face was cracked, the glass eyes cloudy. The doll wore a tiny dress, once white but now stained and frayed. As Jenna stared at the doll, a chill ran through her. The air around her seemed to grow heavy, and for a moment she thought she heard a faint whisper, like a child's voice. She dropped the doll and stepped back, her heart racing. That night, she couldn't sleep. She left the doll on the dining room table and locked herself in her bedroom. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, turning into muffled cries that seemed to seep through the walls. At one point, she thought she heard her name. By morning, she was ready to leave. She packed a bag, planning to stay with a friend until she could figure out what to do. But when she reached the front door, it wouldn't open. The deadbolt was stuck, and no amount of twisting or pulling could budge it. "Come on," she yelled, slamming her shoulder against the door. It didn't move. She tried the back door, then the windows, but it was as though the house had sealed itself shut. Panic set in as she ran from room to room, looking for a way out. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more urgent. By nightfall, the whispers turned into full-fledged screams. They echoed through the house, high-pitched and guttural, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. Jenna huddled in the corner of her bedroom, her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the screams stopped. The silence was deafening. Jenna opened her eyes, her chest heaving. She glanced at the door, half expecting it to fling open on its own, but it remained closed. She stood slowly, her legs shaking. She had to get out. She had to. The doll was sitting on her bed. Jenna froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't brought the doll upstairs. She hadn't touched it since she'd found it in the cabinet. Its cloudy eyes stared straight ahead, its cracked lips frozen in a faint smile. "No," Jenna whispered. "No, no, no." The doll's head tilted ever so slightly. Jenna screamed. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the doll. The bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness. She fumbled for her flashlight, flicking it on. The beam illuminated the empty bed. The doll was gone. A new sound filled the room, soft, shuffling footsteps. They circled her, moving just beyond the flashlight's reach. Jenna swung the beam wildly, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Who's there?" she cried. "What do you want?" The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, from the darkness, a child's voice whispered, "Play with me." Jenna bolted for the door, yanking it open. She ran down the hallway, the flashlight shaking in her hand. The house seemed to stretch and twist around her, the walls narrowing, the floor tilting. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a dissonant chorus. When she reached the front door, she threw herself against it. This time, it gave way, spilling her onto the porch. She didn't stop to look back. She ran to her car, fumbling with the keys, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When the engine roared to life, she peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying beneath her tires. She never returned to the house. Weeks later, she learned that the Victorian had been abandoned once again, the "for sale" sign back in the yard. No one could tell her who had lived there before her or why they had left. The agent wouldn't answer her calls. Jenna moved to a new city, far from the house and its whispers. But sometimes, late at night, she swore she could hear faint knocking on her bedroom wall, as though something or someone had followed her. Story the end.
Story number 18.
The wind howled against the brittle windows of the old farmhouse as Sarah tightened her scarf and looked around the room. She had inherited the place from her grandmother, a woman she'd barely known but remembered for her peculiar habits and eerie stories. Sarah had never visited the house before, though her family spoke of it often. They said it was too isolated, too strange, a place where time seemed to stand still. She was here now, though, determined to clean it out and sell it. The drive to the rural countryside had been long and unsettling, winding through endless fields and woods until the road narrowed into a single lane. When she finally arrived, the house looked exactly as she imagined, tall, dark, and leaning slightly, as if bowing to the wind. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old wood, with a hint of something metallic. The air felt colder than it should, even for a winter evening. The furniture was all covered in white sheets, like forgotten ghosts waiting for someone to notice them. Her grandmother's possessions, untouched for years, made Sarah feel as though she were trespassing on a lifelong gone. As Sarah explored the house, she found herself drawn to an upstairs bedroom. It was small, with faded floral wallpaper and a single window that overlooked the woods. A rocking chair sat in the corner, its paint peeling. On the dresser was an old photograph of a girl no older than 8, her dark eyes staring out with an intensity that unsettled Sarah. She picked up the photograph. There was no name or date written on it, but something about the girl felt familiar. Her black hair was tied with a ribbon, and she wore a dress that looked handmade. Sarah frowned, trying to recall if her grandmother had ever mentioned a child. The sun was setting by the time she decided to stop exploring. She made a quick dinner in the outdated kitchen, then settled into the living room with a cup of tea. The house creaked as it settled, each groan of the floorboards echoing through the empty rooms. She tried to focus on her book, but her attention kept drifting back to the photograph. As the clock struck midnight, Sarah decided to head to bed. She chose one of the guest rooms downstairs, too uneasy to sleep in her grandmother's room or the one with the rocking chair. She turned off the lights and climbed under the thick, musty blankets, listening to the wind batter the house. She woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was the wind or her imagination, but as she lay still, holding her breath, the sound grew clearer. Slow, deliberate footsteps moved above her, pacing back and forth. Her heart pounded. She hadn't locked the door. Who would come all the way out here? But now she wished she had. Gripping her phone, she tiptoed into the hallway. The house was silent except for the creaking above. She considered calling the police, but the thought of explaining herself felt ridiculous. Instead, she crept up the stairs, the flashlight on her phone barely cutting through the darkness. The footsteps stopped the moment she reached the landing. The silence was oppressive, pressing against her like a weight. She stood there, heart racing, before finally whispering, "Hello?" Nothing. The house seemed to hold its breath. She turned toward the room with the rocking chair, and her stomach sank. The door, which she had left slightly ajar, was now wide open. Her flashlight trembled as she stepped closer, illuminating the room. The chair was rocking, slowly back and forth, though there was no breeze to move it. Sarah froze, her mind racing. She wanted to run but couldn't force her legs to move. As she stood there, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, her breath visible in the dim light. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The chair stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, and then, just as she was about to turn and flee, she heard it. A faint giggle, high and childlike. Sarah bolted down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her keys and phone, ready to leave the house, but when she reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. She twisted the lock, yanked the handle, but it stayed firmly shut as though something on the other side was holding it closed. A cold breeze swept through the hallway, carrying with it the faint smell of roses. Sarah turned slowly, her back against the door. The house felt alive, watching her, waiting. "Leave me alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. A shadow moved at the top of the stairs. It was small, no taller than a child, and it lingered for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. Sarah's knees buckled, and she slid to the floor, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The giggle came again, closer this time. Sarah crawled backward until she hit the wall, her eyes darting around the room. "Who are you?" she managed to choke out. There was no answer, but the air grew colder, the shadows in the corners of the room deepening. The faint sound of humming drifted down the stairs, a soft melodic tune that sent shivers down her spine. It was the kind of song a mother might sing to a child, and yet it was filled with a sadness that made Sarah's chest ache. She had to get out. Scrambling to her feet, she ran to the kitchen, searching for anything that could help her break the door or a window. She grabbed a heavy cast iron pan and swung it at the nearest window, but the glass didn't even crack. It was as if the house itself was keeping her trapped. Suddenly, the humming stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. Sarah turned, pan still in hand, and saw the girl from the photograph standing in the doorway. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her dark eyes glistened with something that looked like tears. She didn't move, didn't speak. She only stared. Sarah felt rooted to the spot, unable to tear her gaze away. "What do you want?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. The girl tilted her head, her black hair falling over her shoulder. Slowly, she raised a hand and pointed toward the rocking chair upstairs. "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "I'm not going back up there." The girl's expression didn't change. She simply stood there, her finger pointing, waiting. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows, and the lights flickered. Sarah felt the walls closing in, the house pressing against her like it wanted her to obey. Reluctantly, she began to climb the stairs, her legs heavy with dread. The rocking chair was still. The air was so cold now that Sarah's teeth chattered. She stepped into the room, the girl's presence like a shadow at her back. On the dresser where the photograph had been, there was now an old, leather-bound journal. It looked fragile, the pages yellowed with age. Sarah picked it up, her fingers trembling, and flipped it open. The entries were written in a delicate hand, describing the life of a young girl named Evelyn, who lived in the house long before Sarah's grandmother. Evelyn's writing grew darker as the entries progressed, speaking of a figure that visited her at night, whispering her name and sitting in the rocking chair. She begged her parents to believe her, but they dismissed her fears as childish imagination. The final entry was short, the handwriting jagged and desperate. "It won't let me leave. It says I belong to the house now." As Sarah read, the room grew colder still. She turned to find the girl standing by the window, her eyes locked on the journal. "Evelyn?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. She raised her hand again, this time pointing to the floor. Sarah looked down and saw faint scratches in the wood, as though something had been dragged across it. Gripping the journal, she dropped to her knees and began prying at the floorboards. They came loose with surprising ease, revealing a small, hollow space beneath. Inside was a rusted tin box. Sarah opened it with trembling hands, finding a lock of dark hair, a ribbon, and a small weathered note. "Forgive me," the note read. "I couldn't save her." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she realized the handwriting matched the journal's earlier entries. Evelyn's parents had known. They'd tried to stop whatever was happening, but they'd failed. The girl was gone when Sarah looked up. The room felt lighter, warmer, as though a weight had been lifted. She returned the box to the floor and carefully replaced the boards. The wind outside had died down, and the house was silent once more. When Sarah finally tried the front door again, it opened with ease. She didn't look back as she stepped into the cold night air, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her leave. She sold the property a month later without telling the buyers what she had experienced. She wasn't sure she believed in ghosts, but she knew one thing for certain: the house on the hill was not empty, and it never would be. Story the end.
Story number 19.
The rain began just as Leah pulled into the driveway of the house she had been hired to clean. It was an old colonial, the kind with narrow windows, sloping eaves, and peeling white paint that seemed to whisper of forgotten years. She worked for a small cleaning service in town, and the job had come in suddenly. The new owners wanted the place spotless before they moved in, but they hadn't arrived yet, leaving the house completely empty. Leah parked her car, grabbed her supplies, and approached the front door. The key had been left in a small lockbox along with a note. "House is mostly empty, just needs a good deep clean. Check the attic for any remaining junk. Thank you." The door groaned as she pushed it open, and the air inside was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something earthy, like wet leaves. Leah stepped into the foyer, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The house was dim, even in the daylight, yet with long shadows stretching across the hardwood floors. She shivered and reminded herself it was just an old house. Nothing more. Leah started in the kitchen. The cabinets were empty, save for a few mismatched plates and a chipped coffee mug. The sink dripped steadily, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. She scrubbed the countertops and swept the floors, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Every so often, she caught herself glancing over her shoulder, convinced she'd see something, or someone, standing in the doorway. By the time she reached the second floor, the rain had turned into a downpour, hammering against the windows. The upstairs was almost entirely empty, except for a single room at the end of the hall. The door was closed, and Leah hesitated before opening it. Inside, she found a child's bedroom. The wallpaper was faded and peeling, decorated with pastel flowers. A small bed sat in the corner, the mattress stripped bare. On the floor was a single wooden rocking horse, its paint chipped and worn from years of use. Leah felt a pang of sadness. This room had once belonged to a child, but now it was just another forgotten space in a forgotten house. She began cleaning, wiping down the windows and sweeping the floor. As she worked, she thought she heard something, soft, like the creak of wood. She paused, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Shaking her head, she returned to her work. It wasn't until she bent to pick up the rocking horse that she noticed it. The chair in the corner of the room, the one she was certain had been empty when she entered, was now occupied. A doll sat there, its glass eyes staring at her. It wore a faded dress and its porcelain face was cracked, giving it a sinister appearance. Leah's breath caught in her throat. She backed out of the room, heart pounding. She didn't remember seeing the doll before, but she convinced herself she must have overlooked it. Maybe it had been there the whole time. Downstairs, the rain continued to lash at the windows, and the house groaned as the wind pushed against its old frame. Leah tried to shake off her unease, focusing on the last task, the attic. She found the pull cord for the hatch in the upstairs hallway and gave it a tug. The ladder unfolded with a loud creak, and a rush of cold air spilled into the hallway. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a single bulb dangling from the ceiling. Leah climbed the ladder cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The space was cluttered with old boxes, broken furniture, and dusty trunks. It smelled of mothballs and decay. She began sorting through the mess, stacking boxes to one side and sweeping away cobwebs. As she worked, she found a stack of old photographs tied together with twine. The images were faded, but one caught her attention. It was a picture of a little girl, no older than 5 or 6, sitting on a rocking horse. Her dark hair was tied with ribbons, and she wore a somber expression. Leah felt a chill run down her spine. The girl looked eerily familiar, but she couldn't place her. She tucked the photo back into the stack and moved to the next box, trying to ignore the feeling of dread creeping up her neck. Then she heard it, a faint giggle, soft and high-pitched, coming from the direction of the hatch. She froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly, she turned her flashlight toward the ladder. It was empty. The attic was silent again, except for the rain pounding on the roof. Leah's hands trembled as she packed up the last of the boxes. She wanted to leave, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The giggle came again, louder this time, and Leah's flashlight flickered. She spun around, the beam of light sweeping across the attic, but she saw nothing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking. No response, just the sound of the rain and her own ragged breathing. She made her way to the ladder, ready to leave, but as she stepped onto the first rung, the attic hatch slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. Leah screamed, her flashlight flickering and then dying completely. She fumbled for her phone, but before she could turn on the light, she heard it again, the giggle, right behind her. Leah turned, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't see anything, but she felt a presence, cold and heavy, pressing against her like a weight. The air was thick, and she struggled to breathe. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I just want to leave." The attic was silent for a long moment, and then she felt it. A hand on her shoulder. It was small, like a child's, and impossibly cold. Leah screamed and scrambled down the ladder, nearly losing her footing in her panic. She hit the hallway floor hard, but she didn't stop. She ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty house until she reached the front door. This time it opened. She stumbled outside, gasping for air, the rain soaking her clothes. She didn't look back as she ran to her car and sped away, the headlights cutting through the storm. Leah never returned to the house, and she refused to take any more cleaning jobs after dark. But sometimes when she's alone at night, she hears it. The soft creak of wood, the faint sound of a child's giggle. And she wonders if the house is waiting for her to come back. Story the end.